The Discoverers, Chapter 8, Mother of Machines. Precisely because the clock did not start as a practical tool shaped for a single purpose, it was destined to be the mother of machines. The clock broke down the walls between kinds of knowledge, ingenuity, and skill, and clockmakers were the first consciously to apply the theories of mechanics and physics to the making of machines. Progress came from the collaboration of scientists, Galileo, Huygens, Hooke, and others, with craftsmen and mechanics. Since clocks were the first modern measuring machines, clockmakers became the pioneer scientific instrument makers. The enduring legacy of the pioneer clockmakers, though nothing could have been further from their minds, was the basic technology of machine tools. The two prime examples are the gear, or toothed wheel, and the screw. The introduction of the pendulum by Galileo and then by Huygens made it possible for clocks to be 10 times more accurate than they had been. But this could be accomplished only by precisely divided and precisely cut toothed wheels. Clockmakers developed new, simpler, more precise techniques both for dividing the circumference of a circular metal plate into equal units and for cutting the gear teeth with an efficient profile. Clocks also required precision screws, which in turn required the improvement of the metal lathe. Gears were, of course, the essential connective tissue in a mechanical clock. The teeth in the wheels within the clock were not apt to be accurately spaced or cleanly cut if they were hand-hewn. The first gear-cutting machine of which we have any record is the work of an Italian craftsman, Juanello Torriano of Cremona, 1501 to 1575, who went to Spain in 1540 to make an elegant, large planetary clock for Emperor Charles V. Torriano spent 20 years planning a timepiece with 1,800 gear wheels and then 3.5 years building it. Quote, so every day, not counting holidays, his friend reported, he had to make more than 3 wheels that were different in size, number, and shape of teeth, and in the way in which they were placed and engaged. But in spite of the fact that this speed is miraculous, even more astounding is a most ingenious lathe that he invented to carve out with a file iron wheels to the required dimension and degree of uniformity of the teeth. No wheel was made twice because it always came out right the first time. During Torriano's lifetime, his lathe was already being used by other clockmakers. It appears to have become the model for the wheel-cutting machines used by English and French clockmakers in the 17th century, when timepieces were reaching a wider market. Without such a device, it would have been impossible for clocks to be made in large numbers for the commercial market. With such a gear-cutting machine, it was possible to make countless other machines and scientific instruments. The screw, like the gear, was essential for a new world of machines. Its prototypes, like those of the gear, go back to the time of Archimedes or before. An ancient Greek scientist, Hero, may have devised a screw-cutting tool, but making a simple screw long remained a difficult operation. Until the mid-19th century, when finally screws were made with points, it was always necessary in advance to prepare a hole for the full length of the screw. During the Middle Ages, metal screws were rare. For centuries, the screw was used in the wine press and for irrigation before it was applied to printing and to the pressing of coins. The wooden threaded barrels of wine presses were laboriously made. First, the diagonal channels were marked, then cut by hand. The earliest recorded mechanical device for threading a screw was the work of clockmakers. By about 1480, a German clockmaker had devised a remarkable little lathe, operated by a crank handle and equipped with what was later known as a compound slide rest. The first all-metal lathes were made by clockmakers and for clockmakers. Later lathes, basic for the machine tool industry, were little more than elaborations of the clockmaker's early design. The pioneer clockmakers of the 17th and 18th centuries proved to be the pioneer lathe makers. Improvements in the clock required improvements in the lathe. For example, the spring-driven clock used a special kind of conical screw device a fusée, as the gear to compensate for the varying force exerted by driving spring as it unwound. But the spiral groove in this fusée was difficult to cut by hand with the required accuracy. By 1741, French clockmakers had invented a fusée machine that cut the spiral groove on the tapered barrel and so made it possible to produce clocks and watches in larger numbers for the commercial market. This fusée cutting machine still required skill to direct the tool that cut the channel as the barrel was turned. In 1763, the famous Swiss clockmaker Ferdinand Berthaud made a fully automatic fusée machine, which incidentally was one of the earliest examples of building the skill into the machine. The next step was taken by Jesse Ramsden in 1735 to 1800, an English instrument maker with a celebrated passion for precision. He drew on the techniques of the early clockmakers to make a lathe that produced the master screw required for his dividing engine, which made it possible to turn out countless other new scientific instruments: sextants, theodolites, micrometers, balances, barometers, microscopes, and telescopes. The Great Salisbury clock from 1380, the oldest clock still operating in England and said to be the oldest surviving mechanical clock in the world, was made without the use of a single screw thread. Its iron frame was held together by rivets or wedges. Much of its construction was the work of a blacksmith who must have made the holes for the arbor pivots, rivets, and wedge bolts by punching through the hot metal. The diffusion of clocks came only with the making of smaller, portable clocks. If clocks were to be supplied not only to monasteries and town halls and noble palaces, but to individual citizens, they had to be made in sizes suitable for a modest house or a craftsman's shop. This required scaling down the design, which brought a whole new technology of precision machine craftsmanship. A small clock, obviously, could not be hammered together or forged by a blacksmith. To assemble it without knocking it apart, screws were needed. Smallness required screws, and then screws made possible a host of other portable machines. Of course, smaller clocks appealed to a wider market, and the demands of this wider market, in turn, were incentives to making cheaper clocks that people could afford to buy. By the 17th century, clockmakers had advanced spectacularly ahead of other technology of the age and had begun to apply the principle of division of labor. In 1763, Ferdinand Berthaud could list 16 different sorts of workmen involved in producing clocks and 21 making watches. Among these were makers of the movement, finishers, borers, makers of springs, engravers of brass needles, pendulum makers, engravers of dials, polishers of brass parts, enamelers of dials, silverers of brass dials, engravers of cases, bronze gilders, painters to imitate gilding and colors, founders of wheels, turners, and polishers of bells. The clocks stimulated new talents, new kinds of understanding and imagination. In the age of the French Revolution, Condorcet, the mathematician, philosopher, and encyclopedist, while praising an inventor of improvements in silk weaving machinery, observed, "Generally speaking, people have a very erroneous idea of the type of talent proper to the ideal mechanism. He is not a good geometrician who, delving into the theory of movement and the categories of phenomena, formulates new mechanical principles or discovers unexpected laws of nature. In most other branches of science are to be found constant principles. A multitude of methods offer to the genius inexhaustible possibilities. If a scholar poses himself a new problem, he can attack it fortified by the pooled knowledge of all his predecessors. No elementary textbook contains the principles of this new science. No one can learn its history. The workshops, the machines themselves, know what has been achieved, but results depend on individual effort. To understand a machine, it has to be divined. This is the reason why talent for mechanics is so rare and can go so easily astray, and this is why it is hardly ever manifested without that boldness and the errors which, in the infancy of science, characterize genius." The clock enticed men across boundaries of religion, language, and politics. Even before the vast colonial migrations and the settlement of the New World, the movements of skilled craftsmen exerted an influence far out of proportion to their numbers. Before power-driven transportation, before the rise of mass production, it was often the craftsmen themselves, rather than their product, that traveled. When clocks were gigantic machines built into the tops of public towers, these had to be erected where they would be used. At first, there was no demand for more than one clock to a community, which meant, of course, that the professional clockmaker had to be a traveler. A clockmaker came from Basel to build the Strasbourg Cathedral clock in the early 1350s, then went on to construct the first public clock in Lucerne. A German clockmaker made the first clock in the royal palace in Paris. A Paris clockmaker journeyed to Avignon in 1374 to make a clock for the Pope. While it was unusual to build a large clock in one place for use in another, there were a few famous exceptions. Genoa's first mechanical public clock was actually made in Milan in 1353, and the elegant clock we can still see on the Piazza San Marco in Venice was brought there from Reggio. After clocks were scaled down into small, fragile machines, there were new reasons for making them near their customers. Centuries passed in Europe before there were enough clockmakers in any one place to form a guild to protect their monopoly. The earliest clockmakers were drawn from blacksmiths, locksmiths, or gun founders. A clockmakers' guild was begun in 1544 in Paris and in 1601 in Geneva. Not until 1630 was a clockmakers' company chartered in England, a result of complaints in 1627 that, quote, the clockmakers' freemen of this city are exceedingly oppressed by the intrusion of clockmakers' strangers. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the local market in European metropolises supported settled groups of clockmakers who organized to enforce their monopoly against foreigners. The market for their product attracted some. Political and religious upheaval and epidemics pushed out others. In the 15th century, Italy had been a mecca for craftsmen who came to serve Lorenzo the Magnificent de' Medici, 1449 to 1492, in Florence, and others in Milan, Genoa, Rome, or Naples. In the 16th century, skilled craftsmen, victims of religious persecution in Germany, went out to enrich metropolises everywhere. In France, it seemed that a considerable number of clockmakers had become Protestants, and so were targets of Catholic regimes that forced them to move on. Before the end of the 15th century, there were no great centers of clockmaking in Europe. For a while, Augsburg and Nuremberg flourished by building on their traditions of metalworking. Peter Heinlein, the clockmaker of Augsburg, was given legendary credit for inventing the pocket watch. But the chaos of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, dispersed Augsburg and Nuremberg clockmakers all over Europe. By the 18th century, the most precise and most elegant timepieces were being made in Geneva and in London. The future of the pioneer machine lay in two islands, in Switzerland, isolated by mountain barriers, and in sea-girt England. Here were safe gathering places where mobile craftsmen from all Europe could meet, combine, and exchange their talents. London and Geneva would reap the fruits of persecution by others. The Protestant Reformation, which divided Western Christendom, had brought a new era of upheaval, persecution, and mobility. In 1517, Luther nailed up his provocative 95 Theses on the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, and so opened the Reformation in Germany. Within 2 years, Zwingli was preaching Reformation in Zurich. Within another decade, Calvin announced the Reformation in France. Banished from Paris, Calvin took refuge in Basel, where he published his Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, the first textbook of Protestant Christianity. In the next decades, the thousands who followed Calvin to Geneva made that city a center for European refugees. Just as 4 centuries later, the Nazi and fascist persecutions would make the United States a world center of atomic physics, so independent Geneva profited in the science and technology of its day and speedily became a world center of clockmaking. In both eras, a few refugees with specialized skills could make all the difference. In 1515, when the clock in Geneva's Cathedral of St. Pierre needed repairing, There still was no qualified clockmaker in the city. But soon after 1550, as the persecution of Protestants heated up in France and elsewhere, the clockmakers arrived. To Geneva, they came not only from France, but also from the Low Countries, from Germany, and from Italy. By 1600, Geneva counted some 25 master clockmakers, in addition to an unrecorded number of apprentices and workmen. Before the 17th century was over, more than 100 masters and some 300 workers there were turning out 5,000 clocks a year. Protestant England also became a place of refuge, and the rise of English clockmaking was a measure of the persecutions across the Channel. In the earliest era of mechanical clocks, England was not a land of pioneers, but it offered a vacuum of skills into which the enterprising foreigners gladly flowed. When Henry VIII needed repairs on the clock in Nonsuch Palace, he still had to import Frenchmen. Queen Elizabeth too used French clockmakers. There's no record of an English-made watch before 1580, and those made in the next 2 decades were slavish copies of French or German models. In due time, the growing number of native English clockmakers complained of the many strangers invading this realm, and argued that they needed a royally chartered guild monopoly, which was finally granted in 1631. One of these troublesome strangers was Louis Couper, whose family moved from Germany to become eminent among the clockmakers of Blois in France, before immigrating to London about 1620. In the early 17th century, England continued to live on borrowed talents. The Fromentil family of London, still famous among clock collectors, came from the Netherlands. They were the first to make pendulum clocks in England, an art that John Fromentil had gone to the Netherlands to learn from Huygens and Coster. But before the end of the century, an Englishman, Robert Hooke, was making epochal improvements in clock design, and by the early 18th century, London took its place beside Geneva. In England, watchmaking was showing the advantages of specialization and the division of labor. The Clerkenwell district of London housed various groups of workmen who called themselves escapement makers, engine turners, fusee cutters, secret springers, or finishers. The Clockmakers' Company reported to the Board of Trade in 1781 that they were exporting about 80,000 clocks and watches each year to Holland, Flanders, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Turkey, the West and East Indies, China, and elsewhere. In the tolerant interval after the Edict of Nantes, 1598, granted the French Huguenots freedom of worship, and before it was revoked in 1685, French clockmaking seems to have been growing. But the French guilds still excluded new talent, inhibited movement into new lines of work, and enforced countless narrow monopolies. While in England, makers of new scientific instruments, depending on whether their main interests were mechanical or optical, could join either the Clockmakers' Company or the Spectacle Makers' Company. Some managed to pursue their craft without joining either, and many joined the Grocers' Company. In France, guild membership was strictly enforced. When the making of mathematical instruments was first listed among French monopolies in 1565, it was assigned to the cutlery engravers, with King Charles IX's express prohibition that, except for members of that guild, quote, no one may make shears or scissors, nor surgical instruments of metal, nor cases for falconry, or any other cases furnished with astrological and geometrical instruments. As it turned out, fine scientific instruments had to be made of brass, and the smelting of copper necessary for making brass was reserved only for the Founders Guild. The result was lengthy and acrimonious disputes over who held this particular monopoly. At the end of the 17th century, when barometers and thermometers were being made commercially in France, they came under the monopoly of the enamelers, simply because the graduated scale was inscribed on an enameled metal plate. During the 18th century, an age of innovation in Europe, while French guilds were imposing exorbitant dues on their own members and restricting the numbers of apprentices and of workshops, the guilds themselves were also being exorbitantly taxed by a domineering government. French instrument makers at the same time were snubbed by men of science who thought them no better than manual workers or tradesmen and kept them out of the learned societies. From time to time, the French government made strenuous but futile efforts to invigorate the craft. The famous English clockmaker and horologist Henry Sully, 1680 to 1728, was imported to be a clockmaker to the Duke of Orleans. But all of Sully's efforts, even his importation of 60 skilled English craftsmen, could not overbalance the retarding forces in the French society, and his workshops at Versailles and Saint-Germain were soon abandoned. Life in England, looser guild restrictions, and the increasing demands of a growing, prosperous middle class for clocks and watches was much more favorable to the clockmakers' crafts. Competition increased and the market widened. It is not surprising that when seamen of the expanding worldwide empires required seafaring clocks and better scientific instruments of all sorts, English clockmakers were pioneers. Philosophers were always looking for new handles on the universe, new similes, new metaphors, new analogies. Despite their scorn for those who cast the creator of the universe in man's image, the theologians never ceased to scrutinize man's own handiwork as their clues to God. Now, man was a proud clockmaker, a maker of self-moving machines. Once set in motion, the mechanical clock seemed to tick with a life of its own. Might not the universe itself be a vast clock, made and set in motion by the Creator himself? This interesting possibility, not conceivable until the mechanical clock was on the scene, would be a main way station toward modern physics. The older view of the movement of physical bodies, as expounded by Aristotle, was that nothing moved unless it was constantly being pushed by some outside force. But by the time the first mechanical clocks were striking in the town belfries of Europe, an interest in predictable regularities was growing toward a new theory of motion. Now, it was argued, things kept moving because forces originally imprinted on them, vis impressa, that simply continued to operate. De Dondy's elegant model of a clockwork universe, recently completed, was already astounding the scholarly world. In the late 14th century, an influential French popularizer of science, Bishop Nicole d'Oresme, 1330 to 1382, created the unforgettable metaphor, a clockwork universe, and God, the perfect clockmaker. And, quote, if anyone should make a mechanical clock, Oresme added, would he not make all the wheels move as harmoniously as possible? This metaphor guided and inspired scientists like the great astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630. My aim, he observed in 1605, is to show that the celestial machine is to be likened not to a divine organism, but rather to a clockwork. And Descartes, too, the philosopher-mathematician, made the clock his prototypical machine. His doctrine of dualism, that mind and body operated independently, was explained in the famous clock metaphor. Suppose there were two clocks, Descartes' Dutch disciple Glulinx suggested, both of which kept perfect time. When one points to the hour, the other always strikes. If you did not know about their machinery and how they were made, you might mistakenly assume that the movements of one caused the other to strike. That is the way both the mind and the body function. God, the clockmaker, created each quite independently of the other, then wound up both of them and set them going so they are in perfect harmony. When I decide to lift my arm, I may think my mind is acting on my body, but really both move independently, each a part of God's perfectly harmonized clockwork. This fertile mother of machines was the missing link between man's own efforts to master his physical universe and his awed reverence before his creator. In the 17th century, the pioneer Puritan physicist and founder of the Royal Society, Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, saw the universe as, quote, a great piece of clockwork. And his Catholic contemporary, Sir Kenelm Digby, 1603 to 1665, agreed that the universe was just that. The Newtonian universe soon elevated God from a clockmaker to a master engineer and mathematician. Now, the universal laws that govern the smallest portable watch also governed the movements of the earth, the sun, and all the planets. Even after the clock ceased to be the master metaphor of the universe, it became more than ever master of daily life on this planet. The clock made it possible for Europeans to be on time. By the late 17th century, when clocks were not uncommon among the literate and wealthy, the word punctual, which formerly had described a person who insisted upon points, from the Latin punctus, points, or details of conduct, came to describe a person who was exactly observant of an appointed time. By the late 18th century, the word punctuality appeared in our language to describe the habit of being in good time. "Oh, madam," Joseph in Sheridan's School for Scandal, 1777, reproached, "punctuality is a species of constancy, a very unfashionable custom among ladies." The clock brought its own morality. Punctuality, creature of the clock, was still not listed among the dozen virtues in which Benjamin Franklin aimed to make himself perfect. By 1760, when Lawrence Sterne wrote his mock heroic Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, he opened his saga with the most modern possible interruption of his hero's conception. At the crucial moment when Tristram's mother and father were in bed, and Tristram was about to be conceived, "Pray, my dear," quoth my mother, "have you not forgot to wind up the clock?" "Good God," cried my father, "did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question?" That's the end of chapter 8. Okay.